Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to our very first TWC Live conversation, which if you are new to AWP, TWC stands for the Writers Chronicle, which is AWP's magazine. My name is James Tate Hill. I am the senior publications editor and the editor of the Writers Chronicle. And you may have noticed, if you were a longtime reader of the Chronicle, that we experienced some big changes in the fall, new look and feel. And one of the new features that we're really excited about is called the Big Conversation. And our very first big conversation was with the group of panelists, or pretty close to this same group of panelists. And you can go back to October's issue and read the print conversation where this all began. And I was so excited when these writers wanted to pick this up and elaborate on and welcome audience questions. And so I'll say up front that in the live chat, you're welcome to put your questions there, and we'll save some time, maybe a quarter till for the panelists to take your questions. I'm not going to take up too much more of your time, but I want to introduce the moderator and panelist, Ilana Masad, and hand this over to her for the conversation so that they can have as much time to discuss things like the intersection of labor and art and freelancing, making a living as a freelance book critic, and a lot of other adjacent topics. So Ilana Masad is a writer of fiction, nonfiction, and criticism whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, NPR, the Atlantic, and many more. She holds a doctorate from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is the author of the novel All My Mother's Lovers and co-editor of the forthcoming anthology Here for All the Reasons, Bachelor Nation's, I'm sorry, I botched the Bachelor subtitle, Bachelor Nation. But her second novel, Beings, comes out September 23rd, 2025 with Bloomsbury. And we're really excited to have you moderating this conversation, Ilana. And I'm going to hand it totally over to you to introduce your fellow panelists. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, James. So yes, thank you for being here for this panel, this inaugural TWC Live. And let me just quickly introduce our panelists. So Daniel Felsenthal is a writer, critic, poet, and experimental DJ whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Nation, The Los Angeles Times, Pitchfork, and The Village Voice, among many other publications. He teaches creative writing at Columbia University and is an assistant editor at Noon. Meyer Kreizman is a columnist for LitHub. Her work has appeared in the New York Magazine, the New York Times, Vanity Fair, Esquire, The New Republic, and more. Her newsletter is called The Maris Review. Her essay collection, I Want to Burn This Place Down, will be published on July 1st, 2025, and we are all very excited about it. Lily Meyer is a translator, critic, and author of the novel Short War, which is excellent. She is a contributing writer at The Atlantic. Her translations include Claudia Ulloa Donoso's story collections Little Bird and Ice for Martians. Her novel The End of Romance is forthcoming from Viking, and we are excited for that as well. Welcome, all of you. So the first thing I want to ask us all about is let's talk about what it means to make a living. Do any of you actually make a living wage doing freelance book criticism? And if you're comfortable, I'd love for you to share some specific rates or how much you've made this or last year from criticism alone.
The short answer is no. The first thing I always like to say when I talk about my freelance career is I only was able to start doing it when I got married in 2017 to be able to be on my husband's health insurance. And without that, I would still be in some corporate job, I hope. And so I probably make $30,000 a year on freelance. And I'm including my newsletter in that too.
And you live in New York, right?
Sorry.
You live in New York, so
And I live in New York, and
in New
I
York.
would not be able to be here if my husband wasn't with me. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I will add my no to Maris's. I always say that I have 3 roles in my bio, and that's because I make a third of my living as a critic, a translator, and a novelist. And that only became true recently. I began to freelance seriously when I moved in with my boyfriend. Now my boyfriend is my husband and he has the healthcare. Although he is a civil servant, I know he's in the next room listening. He's a civil servant. If Elon Musk lays him off, that's the end of me as a critic, because that means we have to both go look for jobs with healthcare as soon as possible. So do I make a living in terms of money right now? Yes, I made about $50,000 as a critic last year, which was by far the most I'd ever made. And I sold a bunch of books, both my own and translations. If I can keep that up, that's great. But great as it is, Obamacare is real expensive.
Yeah, I have to add a third no to the chorus, unsurprisingly. I don't think it's possible to make enough money as a freelance critic to live basically anywhere in the US right now. Certainly not in New York City, where I live. My trajectory to becoming a freelance critic and being able to do it regularly was like a lot of you, like meeting my current husband, and we moved in together maybe 3 years after we met, and he has a supremely rent stabilized apartment. Now we have a supremely rent stabilized apartment that allows you to take risks as an artist that I couldn't really take before. I quit my job in 2023 at the very beginning of the year because I had a grant, and because I had such cheap rent that my overhead wasn't very high. I probably made $15,000 off of criticism last year. There's always some other factor that enables you to do this, and that's seriously a shame, because there's so many people whose voices we need and who need to be talking about literature and other art forms right now.
Yeah, I will unfortunately add a fourth no to the chorus. Despite the title of this panel, none of us are really making a living entirely on our own. And yeah, since I graduated college, a decade and a half ago nearly, I have never had just the one gig, right? Like many of us, I think, have been balancing part-time work with freelance work, with gig work. And I think I made last year about $12,000 in criticism, which is a little lower than I usually would because I had a baby. And what do you know? Babies, A, are very expensive to have. And B, despite California, which is where I live, being one of the states touted as being great for labor, there are absolutely no protections in place or government assistance in place for freelancers. So I wasn't able to go on disability for my parental leave. I wasn't able to get any state-funded parental leave. I just didn't work for a while. So that is the unfortunate reality that we're all living in. Now, part of the reason we all know each other, other than knowing each other through sort of literary circles, is that we are all part of the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is the digital wing of the National Writers Union. And we all care about our work, but we also care about being paid fairly for our labor, which makes our participation in the freelance workforce inherently political. In what other ways do you feel like your criticism and or your labor is political?
Why don't I go? One of the things about my work right at this very moment that's political is I'm really involved in Authors Against Book Bans, which is a group of authors who are a one-topic organization to fight book bans wherever they may be. And as a critic, I'm not just reviewing banned books, but I do use my platform to let other authors know that we're there. We're there to go to school board meetings. We're there to commiserate. We're there to write letters. And it's a scary time right now. And it feels like a good way to chip in.
I would say that I have an overarching politics of what I choose to write about. I'm a translator. I have reviewed a lot of translated literature in my now 11-year career as a freelancer. For a time, I really was a translation critic. I am no longer entirely a translation critic, in part because I wanted to expand my practice, and in part because you make more money if you review major titles. And in the US, major titles are very rarely translated ones. And that is something I really try to push against. I think that Americans are extremely provincial in our reading. The stat that goes around, this is not quite provable, but roughly 3% of the books that get published, bought, and read here are books in translation. So we're reading 97% one country. It is impossible to me that does not narrow our comprehension of possibility. It is bad for empathy. It's bad. It's bad for the very simple reason that if we look at what's happening in other countries, literarily, politically, on any front, that expands our vision of what could happen here. And my politics of being a critic is that I try to push against that with my criticism wherever, however I can.
Yeah, that was really nicely put, both of you. I'm really struck frequently by how totalitarian governments across the world and across history, and we're seeing this begin now in the US, go after culture. And we're often told that culture is this kind of decorative, effete thing that only the rich can do. And there's a lot of defanging of it in the conversation, even as we're all working to make culture something that more people can access and more people can participate in. The truth is that culture is dangerous. And it might not seem dangerous to us because it isn't. It might change our minds, but we're open to that. But it is dangerous to governments. Look at what's happened at the Kennedy Center immediately, the idea of a national culture and a national voice. So on that level, writing about any culture and writing about it seriously without heeding to a party line and without heeding to a vision of it that that kind of says what grounds it could be is a very political act. And I think about that when I write criticism. I also think that my criticism tends to just move into political discussions, because when we're writing criticism, we're always in part writing about ourselves and writing out of our own experiences. And my conscience is just full of politics and has been. One could say it has been my entire life, and I just didn't even realize exactly what politics were. But it's full of explicit politics, it's full of electoral politics, it's full of activist politics, and it's full of just the political reality of living within a state. And so in things I do, I try to find ways of putting that material in there. I write a lot about queer artists and writers, and that is, of course, an increasingly, it's political always, but we're reminded of the urgency of that because we've gone from, 10 years ago, burgeoning moment for at least gay rights, and then opening a lot of kind of the possibility of trans rights, and then that door is closed immediately. So I went from somebody who, was annoyed about getting assignments that were queer just because I'm gay, to somebody who's bring it on. I want to write in this sphere, and I don't see this as something that I just see the politics of that differently at this point. Yeah, and as you know, aside, I mean, I do activist stuff in a lot of different parts of my life for pro-Palestinian politics, for union politics here, and at Columbia, where I teach in the contingent faculty union now. So those things are always in conversation, and our ability to make connections is a politically strengthening act. And whether they're politics and literature connections or connections across art forms, I think that that's just incredibly important. And it's dangerous to the people that want to harm us, whether it seems that way or not.
If I could piggyback on Daniel's idea of danger, it really reminded me of a conversation I had last week with another critic friend of mine, Tope Falarin, who's also based here in DC, we were talking about how important our work is. Is our work important? I was feeling perhaps slightly defeated. And he said, what are you talking about? The right wing is doing cultural criticism all the time on their podcasts. We don't listen to those podcasts. Like, I personally, the criticism I consume is almost all written. But he said those podcasts are making a critique of our culture that has now gotten all the way up to the vice president's office. We know JD Vance is listening to those podcasts in conversation with those guys. And that, to me, was a strong reminder of, in a literal sense, the danger of culture criticism to me. But I would like to hope that on the left, where clearly we all are, cultural criticism could start to resist more loudly and effectively.
I think I would also love to add to what Lily and Daniel were saying. I think that in general, the devaluation of books and the devaluation of criticism is inherently political. And we have to fight that in whatever manner we can in our capitalist society. And I really do believe that reading a good book or reading good criticism is helps the soul. It may not inspire empathy, but it helps get you ready to be open to empathy. How about that?
Yeah, if I could say something more, just like in response to that, I think that, you know, the ability to make an argument and read an argument that's in response to culture is something that enables people to understand how those right-wing podcasts are really like fallacious. I like one thing that I've done to supplement my freelance income is do some fact checking. And I once was fact checking a piece about the far right's obsession with Russia. And I read a lot of like deeply homophobic and deeply anti-Semitic rhetoric from Americans who became like Russophiliacs in the age of Putin. And one of the things that I noticed about reading all of this is that like the beginning of the critique is often like similar to what happens on the left. Corporations are too involved in our government, and that's a problem. The next sentence is often completely incomprehensible if you know how to read. It seems on its surface okay, but you keep reading these things and they make less and less sense. And the ability to read well and to think critically is just something that a lot of people who have been frustrated with the American status quo would benefit from, and would bring them more to the left and away from like the radical anti-establishment right politics. And it's, I don't know, that's been something that has really stuck with me about, you know, how this kind of valuable logic on the right that's like absolutely full of shit is able to really exist in our society. So.
Yeah, you know, I mean, we are obviously all telling on ourselves and that we're pro-union, if nothing else. But I feel like it even goes beyond like thinking about things from the perspective of left or right. There is this sort of the devaluation of literature, as Maris was talking about, and the devaluation of sort of critical reading feels very directly linked to the fact that there is like a rising statistic of illiteracy in this country. And illiteracy is not, it is something that I think there's a lot of shame around, because that is sort of how it is treated, as something shameful. But the reality is that to be illiterate in the culture and time we live in now is dangerous for you. Like it means that you can't access certain things that you need to be able to access as a human being in a world that is fully, online. Much of the forms we have to fill out, right? Like there's so many just basic things that we need to be able to read. I mean, even think about the fact that none of us read terms and conditions anymore, right? Like regardless of literacy, we just don't. And I think it is so important that we not only defend people's right to read, but to have access to learning how to read, and to not sort of give in to this anti-intellectualist idea that we don't need reading, because that is such a way for any government or anyone in power to then more fully control the way that you access information, right? And to more fully control what you're able to see, what you're able to listen to, and so to me, yeah, like reading just feels political, because we know that it is relatively recent in human history that literacy is as broad as it is now, right? Like literacy was something that was preserved for those people in power, which for many places was religion, right? Or government. And we need that to not happen again, And so, yeah, to me, just being able to read critically is so automatically political. And it's telling also, speaking to Lily's point earlier about like looking at what happens in other countries, looking beyond our own borders, we can see that so many totalitarian governments come for culture first, right? They try to control the culture first, because it's useful, because culture is something we all need. It's something we all participate in, whether we think about it or want to or not. It's just a sort of undercurrent of our life. Anyway, okay, so we are currently in Trump's second term. Who knows what will happen after this? We're also just in an era in general of a sort of continuous backlash to the free press, which we're seeing coming from the right, but also I think there is a suspicion of the press and of journalism sort of from all sides of the political spectrum right now, because of a variety of ways in which people have lost faith in a variety of systems, often for good reason. And also there's this sort of tension between what journalists are trying to do, what they're being allowed to do, what they're being allowed to publish, what the owners of various outlets are allowing to happen. And this is only likely to sort of these tensions are only likely to rise, right? We've seen a lot of people quitting recently. And so I'm curious, how do you feel this has had an effect on you as critics or on the places that you write for?
I mean, I can say that as a DC resident, it is significantly harder for me to get news than it used to be, because in addition to suppressing certain opinions in the Washington Post's opinion pages, Jeff Bezos has also caused the Post to turn away from local reporting. And that's a baseline part of living in a city that's important. And I think that we're really seeing, this is not new. This has been going on for years and is very much a private equity related issue, but we're really seeing a shrinking and a narrowing of news outlets of all sorts across the nation. We have so many local papers and local radio stations that have been bought not by billionaires, but by billionaire corporations that don't care about local news. And that really, really harms all of our ability to participate in society where we are. It's hard to know who to vote for if you can't read about the candidates in the local election. And, how are you going to know about the writers living in your city and state if your city newspaper, your state newspaper doesn't have anyone reporting on the literary scene or writing book reviews? If you listen to our bios, and my bio, I think, doesn't have this in it, but could. and you hear the places that we write for, it's New York, New York, New York, New York, New York. We're all writing for these New York-based outlets because they're the ones with money. And of course I write for the places with money because I need to get paid. I need that third of my income that's criticism. But I don't want to only be writing for coastal outlets. I'd love to write for the paper in my hometown. I would also love to write, for my husband's hometown paper in Minnesota. And I can't because there's no money for me there. And that, I think, creates conversational bubbles. I mean, it means there's less information locally. It also means that we're not talking to each other across the country because we can't, because there are places where the critical conversation is quite literally not happening. And that is really, really damaging on all levels, I think.
I like totally agree with that. I mean, the death of local news outlets is really a tragedy. And we're seeing like so many cultural deaths happen because of often because of ne'er-do-well owners of publications, but for a variety of reasons in so many spheres. Like another thing that I do is write about music, and it was so much easier to learn about new music like 9 months ago than it is now. It's actually really bizarre. It's hard to just know what's released, and there's an audience for that. But because the owners of these publications are not in touch with their audience and they're not in touch with journalism at all, and oftentimes acquiring a publication is just kind of a feather in the cap of somebody who has many holdings and a lot of money and is basically just looking at like having consultants look at what they own and decide how profitable they are. There's just a gigantic disconnect in that regard. To kind of bring it into another sphere of how this situation is bad for us, like publications now can often be destroyed in a court by one rich person that wants to destroy them. And with a larger publication, they may have in-house lawyers that can protect writers. But we are constantly, as freelance writers, faced with contracts that don't indemnify us, that are not going to protect us against like legal harm. And at the same time, even if we are indemnified, publications are not going to want to publish things that could simply anger somebody who has money, even if it's true, because just the process of funding a legal case is so tremendous, and these publications will lose against certain billionaires and multimillionaires out there. So there's a lot of there are just a lot of factors that are producing a chilling effect right now.
I think that's right. We have an incredibly litigious president right now. He has cases against Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House, two of the biggest publishers in the country by far. And I worry that an indie press could be completely annihilated by any such kind of lawsuit. And there is so much we have to fight for.
Yes. I just want to remind our participants, or our audience, and I'm seeing some people are already asking questions in the chat, which is great. Please keep doing that. We will reserve the last 15 minutes for questions from the chat. So speaking directly to what you were just saying, Maris, what are you if you could all expand a little on sort of what you're worried about in the months and years ahead, and what are you hoping to fight for? And how are you hoping your editors and potentially sort of staff writers, since they're not that their jobs are particularly safe these days either, but they are on staff, how are you hoping that these people might advocate for you?
I'm hoping that they will fight for a diversity of opinions across the board. And that includes in book criticism and in book publishing. That we have to consider, as Lily was saying, not just the coastal cities, and we have to consider different points of view and ideologies. And what I hope the most, to go back to something I was saying before, is like, what I hope is that the people I work with want to do their part in making other people care about books and about criticism. And that's just such a big part of it to me.
I will say my central hope right now is that everybody who has been elected to the government will get Elon Musk, who is unelected, out of it and start to reverse this trend of billionaires meddling. You know, I want Elon Musk out of government because I don't want him to fire my husband, because that will, like, as I said, that'll be the end of my career as a critic if that happens. But also, I want him out of government for the same reason that I want Jeff Bezos not to be running the Post. The thing that I think that every single person in the United States who is not a billionaire or multimillionaire should be fighting for right now, regardless of any other issue, is to have our government be run by people who were elected, to have our media outlets be run by people who do media, by people whose job is media, and to have the forces that are, you know, keeping us from conversing with each other, to move those forces out of the way. And my editors at places like The Atlantic and the New Republic, they can do that. They can be thoughtful about who they try to get my writing to. They can, as Meyer was saying, they can be thoughtful about the voices that are next to mine in the culture pages. They have a lot of agency. The Atlantic is itself owned by a billionaire, Lorraine Jobs, or billionaire by divorce. I don't love that either. I would very much prefer that it not be. And yet I still want my editors there to support me by continuing to hire me and to support me by getting my work to more people. I really think we have a lot of common interests, just as I think that there are not that many people who cannot enjoy a book. Whatever, it doesn't have to be the same book. It doesn't have to be a book in the same form. I personally have terrible audio retention, so I don't like audiobooks, but that doesn't mean that a person who only listens to audiobooks isn't having the same experience as me on some level. I think there's a lot of conversation that could be happening that isn't, and I would love my editors to be supporting me by facilitating some more of that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of fears for the future, there are many of those. Hopes for the future, like, yeah, there are a lot of routes I can take, particularly like within criticism. I'm hoping that these major holes that exist now, people realize that there's an audience that wants them to be filled. I'm kind of like, with the devaluation of criticism, there's this sense that simply because publications aren't going to produce a kind of like maximal profit, that they shouldn't exist. And that means that no matter what audience there is for them, it will never be enough. And I'm hoping that there are things that slip through and actually fulfill like people's desire for new books, their desire for new culture in general. It shouldn't be hard to find out what books are being released in the next year. Yet every year when I like look for things to review, it's harder and harder to find like, okay, this is what's coming out. This is what's interesting. That's bizarre, because so many people read, and so many people are into culture, and they're into cultural criticism. The students that I teach are all looking for cultural things to read. They're all looking for new books to read, like, all of the time. And I kind of just want that to, result in people like publications just cropping up to fill things. And I think that is actually a possibility, and there could be some kind of new critical players in the game. Maybe not right now, but maybe in 2 years. And I actually think that there's tremendous opportunity right now for somebody new to come onto the scene, like for a new publication entity to come onto the scene. And I'm just like waiting for that. I'm excited about that possibility.
Yeah, let's take a little bit of a more positive turn then, since I think we are all sort of very despondent about the state of our media landscape with regards to criticism. Do any of you have a memory of like a particular piece of criticism or a particular experience of reading a piece of criticism, even if you don't remember what it was, that made you sort of think, oh, this is something that like people can do? Like this is a thing that is possible? Because I think that that's one of the most exciting parts of being a critic is trying to push the boundaries of like what kinds of conversations can you have on the page, with whom can you converse on the page, and I'm sure we all at some point had to have encountered that in order to know that it was a thing that we could do.
I want to start out by talking about the literary blogs that I was reading when I was an assistant at Simon & Schuster in the year 2002. I had always thought of myself as a burgeoning book editor. And I didn't know you could just you didn't have to be in black and white. You could just hop on the computer and tell the world your opinions, hopefully in a measured, exciting way, hopefully with a sense of humor. And that was a valid form of criticism. And that has stuck with me from Jessa Crispin's blog long ago to, I mean, Gawker did great literary stuff, electric literature. There's this small, increasingly small, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to bring it down again, but digital media really opened my eyes to a lot of what criticism can be. And so I sure hope it continues.
Oh, sorry, Lily.
No, go.
Well, I was going to say, I've had like various moments at which like, oh, criticism, and it's come into my life. And probably the earliest one, frankly, was reading like Pitchfork when I was a teenager, which really did a lot of unusual stuff, not always good, but sometimes good, and permissive in some ways. It's also gotten a lot better over the years in terms of having a diversity of voices and like kind of genders and races among writers and among work that they cover. I think before I really became a critic as an adult, I sort of discovered like several decades of criticism in the Village Voice, partially because like my husband turned me onto it and he worked there years ago. And like stuff from the 60s and 70s and 80s, you know, Greg Tate or like Jill Johnston or like any number of people. But I was kind of aware that you could have a really ebullient, vibrant voice in criticism that doesn't hold itself to any academic standard, which like really excited me. And I think that like it's really important that we have these voices that are liberated from the academy and that seem to speak, like make the connection between culture and the way that people actually live. And I think that, like, if you look at a lot of those old voice pieces, they were thinking about how criticism could be literature and how living alongside criticism was a critical act in and of itself. If you could illuminate how people exist alongside cultural objects, that's its own form of analysis. And I felt like I sort of discovered this extant version of criticism, and I just like really wanted there to be more of that now. Also criticism that just crosses media and is like it. I think that in our work, like I kind of said this earlier, but making things feel connected because they are connected is so important. And that's just part of the excitement of living with culture. And no matter what times we live in, I live for that excitement. Like that is one of the true joys of my life.
I remember vividly the moment that I truly understood the difference between a review and a piece of criticism. I want to say I was 26. I had been writing reviews for NPR for a couple of years. I knew on a gut level that what I was doing was writing reviews. I was writing descriptive pieces about one book that didn't get beyond the book. I was learning how to do that. It was a challenge and a skill. And I understood that it wasn't criticism yet, but I didn't quite know why. I didn't have a definition of those two words really. And then I was reading Zadie Smith's essay collection, Feel Free. And I came to an essay about Joni Mitchell, who I'm going to say now the most controversial thing that anyone will say in this panel. I do not like Joni Mitchell. I do not like her voice. Please don't come for me. It just truly does not do it for me. I do not have a good aesthetic experience with her. But I read this essay that Zadie Smith wrote about coming to love Joni Mitchell, coming to appreciate her voice and her songwriting, connecting Joni Mitchell's lyrics to romantic poetry, and in turn connecting romantic poetry to her own, let's say, vexed relationship with Britishness. And I put the book down and I thought, holy shit, that was criticism. And I guess I like Joni Mitchell. I still do not like Joni Mitchell, but the breadth of that piece, its ability to connect both these very different phenomena and connect Smith to me so strongly that I thought I liked this voice that I hate, that has remained to me, that is the apex of criticism. It always has been since then. There's also a fabulous essay in that book called Meet Justin Bieber, which connects Justin Bieber, with whom we're all familiar, I imagine, to the 19th century Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. Just a masterclass. I love Buber myself, not so much on Bieber, although I do prefer him to Joni Mitchell. But that book contains just some absolutely exemplary criticism. And I think that there is truly a place for for reviews, like online reviews written by people who are not professionals. I've actually learned a lot. I'm not too proud to admit that I read my Goodreads. And I've learned a lot about my novel from reading people's reactions on Goodreads. They are helpful, and I am grateful to those people. But that sort of review and the sort of review that I used to write for NPR, they're just doing a different thing than a piece like the Joni piece or Meet Justin Bieber. And that second thing is increasingly, it's what I work towards all the time. It's what makes all of the scrambling and effort and headache and spreadsheets that it takes for me to make a third of my living as a critic. It's worth it to me so that I can write my own Meet Justin Bieber someday too.
I'm going to bring it real lowbrow for a sec here and say that, like, I think I always conceptually as a reader knew that book reviews were a thing, but I don't think I really understood the sort of passion that people could bring to discussions around books at all until I sort of witnessed the phenomenon of like the rise of the blogosphere alongside the publications of Harry Potter, just like the way that the fandom, I mean, like, forget about the author right now, the way that the fandom took itself so seriously and the way that it would read between the lines, to figure out and predict things, the way it would create these like lengthy discussions about character, about, the realities of the world. Like, none of that is exactly criticism, but it opened my eyes to this reality that people could care so deeply about how a piece of literature worked and what it did to them and how it made them feel. And it made me think, oh, wait, so like when people write book reviews, they're not, or criticism, because there is a difference, they're not just like writing what they think. They're like making deductions. They're doing like little analytic detective work, and I think that is one of the joys of criticism, is being able to sort of use your own experience to be like, aha, I see a connection between Martin Buber and Justin Bieber, for instance, right? There's something so thrilling in that. And there's something about it that makes me always think back to sort of that giddy time in your late teens and early 20s when you've maybe met a couple of the people who are like going to be like your people, your people, and you stay up really late at night talking, and you just feel like you're the smartest people in the world just because you're having a long conversation about something you really care about. And so criticism to me is like continuing that feeling, even though I am long past my early 20s. Okay, so we're at the 45-minute mark. So I figure we could do our Q&As. Let's see, we have some questions already. The first one I see is from Philip. I know this isn't the topic, but I wonder whether all of you are fiction and nonfiction critics and how you get the assignments. And I think we all review both fiction and nonfiction. If anyone wants to speak about their assignments a little bit.
I can start. I would say at this point in my career, which again, 11 years, steadily increasing the amount of my time that's criticism versus other things. At this point, it's probably 75 I pitch, 25% I get assigned. I do often get assigned translations for obvious reasons. I sometimes get assigned Jewish stuff because I'm Jewish and like to write about it. And I sometimes will get assigned a literary novel that someone doesn't quite know what to do with. I really like those assignments. I have a very, very close relationship with my editor at The Atlantic. She's been my editor for, I think, 7 years now. She's the only person who habitually assigns me nonfiction. She's really taught me how to review nonfiction, which is one of the many great things that a good editor can do for you, is teach you on just a nuts and bolts level how to argue. I mean, I have many degrees in creative writing, and my Atlantic editor, Jane, has taught me more than any workshop ever did, I have to say. No shade to writing programs, which are wonderful. And she assigns me all kinds of nonfiction. She'll give me academic philosophy to write about. She'll have me, occasionally she'll have me write about some reissued work of nonfiction that's 100 years old. And that I did not ever set out to write about as much nonfiction as I do. I do it because of her. And there's nothing that helps me sharpen my argumentative claws like reviewing nonfiction, I find.
I have a kind of a different story, which is that I always held full-time jobs. And the way I got into criticism was writing an opinion on Twitter and having someone get in my DMs and say, "You want to write about this for us?" And that is really how I started getting in there.
What was the opinion, Maris? I'm curious.
Oh, gosh. I mean, a lot. Oh, God. Let me see if I can think of something off the top of. Oh, I know. I wrote for the New Republic. I wrote about how Naomi Wolf, regardless of what we think of her views now, was incredibly important to me in the 90s. And I went back and kind of talked about why. So yeah, I'm on Blue Sky now. I'm very sad that there doesn't seem to be quite as much engagement anymore on any one platform, but it was a really, really great way to break into the business.
Yeah, I sadly kind of missed the era of getting Twitter assignments, having joined Twitter only a few years ago. I missed almost everything that was good about Twitter, but what I've done in terms of getting assignments, when I started trying to freelance, which was like 6 years ago, I guess, I would pitch like a lot. And I still do that. Increasingly, people ask me to write things. And now that's probably like half of what I do is just like people ask me to do it. And it takes a lot of time out of what you're doing because, you know, pitching is unpaid labor that takes forever. I think that one of the ways that that's worked for me is that like writing not only in books but in a lot of other fields means that like I will get kind of more requests to write, and I have like a lot of different things I can write about, including like, you know, now I write about fiction, not fiction, but I'm also starting to write poetry criticism, and I'm like just so happy that there is a place for that in our current system. You know, that might go before other things, but I'm like thrilled to be platformed in that regard, and I love poetry. So, you know, there's just like a lot of persistence, but I never stopped pitching. Like I never tired of it. I got tired of it, but I never let that affect me. And I think it's you kind of have to do it for a really long time, and particularly in the beginning, you can like people just won't respond to you, and then they'll respond to you and they'll say no, and eventually they'll say yes. So yeah.
Yeah, I got my entrance through the cursed space of listicles that were really, really big in 2013 and 2014. It was sort of my first entrance into writing about books at all for money, even though at the time it was literally $30 per listicle, which even with, you know, adjusting for inflation is still like real bad. And then just slowly I was pitching, and, you know, got ignored, got an answer, got to write a thing. And it has continued. It's just been a continuing journey of a lot of unpaid labor, which is the pitching to get the labor that pays, which is the actual writing about the book. Yeah, I think I probably get like 5% assigned, maybe, despite being in the business for like a decade, you know. But still, it is possible. Again, probably not to make a full living, but to make something. Let's see. What is the effect on criticism of the rise of Substack? That is interesting. And I feel like, Maris, you are, I think, the only one among us with like an actually successful Substack. So I'm really curious to hear what you think.
I think Substack is great for me because I built enough of an audience on Twitter that followed me there. I don't think it's a great place to start out. I don't have an editor. I desperately miss an editor. I miss having someone to bounce ideas off of. I also feel like, yes, there's a social media aspect of Substack that is helpful, but mostly these things are so siloed off that you need to have a subscriber to every single literary publication to have a good talk about where literary criticism is. And that becomes really, really tricky. For transparency, I would say I have 7,400 subscribers, and about 300 of those are paid, which is it's enough to buy a cup of coffee every now and then.
Daniel, Lily, do you have any thoughts on the rise of Substack?
I'm such a grouch. I'm awful at social media. I was never any good at Twitter. I'm not any good at my Instagram. I don't know why I have it. Maris is gifted at social media, I can say, as a longtime consumer. And knowing myself to not be among the Marises of the world, I will not be trying Substack. It's a related skill set, but different enough that I know I don't have it. And that's just me being realistic with myself. It's an avenue I would explore if I thought there was any chance I'd be good at it.
Yeah, it's something I've thought about doing, and I haven't, because I get just wrapped up in doing other things. I mean, there are Substacks that I love and that I read, and I'm really impressed by people's ability to produce on them all the time, and also to produce, so I've seen things on Substacks that have been really like kind of interestingly pointed in a way that I don't know if a publication would publish it, and that's amazing to me. But yeah, it's something that I'm kind of not engaging with in my own writing right now.
Yes, I have a languishing Substack. We have a question about whether any of us are self-published. I mean, I suppose you could say that like writing a Substack is self-publishing, right? It's just using a platform to self-publish. But other than that, I don't think any of us are in terms of like books or other blogs. And then, sorry, I'm just scrolling to find the next question. Oh, yes. Some of you have published books with New York, with NYC Big Five, and others with indies, and some both. Like Lily, I know, is both. So I'm curious how much of your income comes from advances and the role of agents versus on spec versus on contract. That's a lot of questions. So I think we'll probably, just because agents, on spec, on contract, all of that is so messy and complicated that we won't have time for. I will say for myself, very little of my income comes from my advances. And I have now sold one book to a major publisher that got a nice advance, one book that got a very sad advance, and then one book that is an anthology that got an even sadder advance, and we have paid out more than the entire advance to our contributors. So that's where I'm at. Curious about you all.
I go back to what Lily said at the beginning, the rule of thirds. I am probably about a third of getting my income from my advances. And I already told you what one part of my what one part of that pie was. So you can imagine that it's not the most lucrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different. Well, it's different for me on two fronts. Front one is that I got really lucky last year. I sold a book to Viking at auction. I don't think I'm going to be selling books at auction all the time for the rest of my life. So that's great and really lucky for me while it's happening. I also sell translations pretty frequently. I'm a steadily working translator. I've got 4 translations coming out in the next 18 months or so, which my eyeballs, my carpal tunnel, but it's great. I love to translate. I love to get paid to translate. Translators listening, do not translate books on spec. Do not translate a whole book until you have a contract. You can lose a lot of time and money if you do that. And I know because I've done it. As a translator, I have never worked with a big 5, but I've worked now with university presses. I've worked with indies. None of those advances are big at all. And yet, like, they're a couple months of work. Those advances are covering the couple months that it takes me to translate the book. And that it's a very different way of thinking of artistic work. I never really think like, okay, is the amount that I'm getting paid to write this book review going to cover the specific days in which I write it? But it's not a bad way of conceiving of your labor, to really ask, is this money buying this time? And as a translator specifically, what I ask for when I sign a contract is, will the money buy the time? I hope that is helpful. Let me say again, no on spec.
I think that's about all we have time for. So I just want to invite James Tate Hill back to the stage. And James is with us.
Hello, and I just want to thank you all so much for what was an incredibly insightful, and I was just thrilled by all the different directions that I didn't expect the conversation to go. And I thank you all for your time, your honesty, your expertise. AWP, the Writers Chronicle, thank you incredibly deeply for giving us your time tonight. And yeah, insofar as you have given us your time, I want to be respectful of it, but I just wanted to ask you one final question. Anybody who is interested in learning more or participating in this conversation in an active way, in the ways that you all have done with the Solidarity Project and other organizations or websites, if you could direct anybody to those, that would be maybe a good place to conclude.
Absolutely. So freelancesolidarity.org, that is the website you want to go to join FSP. There's instructions there about how to do that, what FSP is. FSP, again, is the Freelance Solidarity Project, which is part of the National Writers Union. So if any of you are already members of the National Writer Union, you can also join FSP. And there's a lot of ways to get involved. Maris, if you want to also share the Authors Against Book Bans.
AuthorsAgainstBookBans.com. Everything is right there. The sign-up link, all of it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that prompting, James. I should have done that all on my own.
No. Yeah, and Maris, Lily, Daniel, Ilana, it's been a pleasure to have you all here. And if you want to read the original conversation that inspired this live conversation, it's in October's issue of the Writers Chronicle. You can get there by going to awpwriter.org and scrolling, or you can go directly writerschronicle.awpwriter.org and just go to the back issues. And thank you so much for being with us. Ilana, Lily, and Maris all have books that are pre-orderable, and I will be doing that. Look for their work, look for Daniel's work anytime you encounter it online. Share the criticism that you enjoy and keep it circulating so that the arts and culture that we all love and need and consume continues to be well funded. So on behalf of AWP and the Writers Chronicle, thank you to everybody who attended, and thank you all for being our first illustrious panelists in this hopefully ongoing series.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Thank you.